So, what are 5 things you should know about decimals? We're going to get right into that. But before we jump into that, please subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share this with a friend. Now, let's get right into it and get started. Okay, so let's talk about 5 things to know about decimals. What are 5 things you can know to really help you with decimals? Important things for you to get to know. So let's go ahead and jump into this and let's take a look at this. First of all, a way to think about decimals. When you think about decimals, let's start off with just think about the number 10, because the word deci literally refers to 10, the number 10. And if you look at this, you notice that obviously 10 is equal to 10. And then if I have 10 times 10, 2 tens, it's going to be 100. And if I have 3 tens, it's going to be 1,000. So that's like a 10 to the power of 3. So we're really talking about powers of 10 here when we talk about decimals. And what that means is, let's say I take 1 divided by 10. That's going to be equal to 0.1, right? That's going to be equal to 0.1, and that's going to be 1/10. That's literally 1/10 of a dollar, or 1/10 of 1. Okay, so let's say I also took 1 and I divided it by 100. What happens when I divide 1 by 100? Well, that's going to be equal to 0.01. That's going to be 1/100th, right? So we've divided that 1 up by 100 pieces, by 100 pieces, if we will. And let's look at 1 divided by 1,000. What is that going to be? 1 divided by 1,000 is going to be equal to 0.001. So that's going to be 1,000ths. So when you think about a decimal, really think about it like it's a fraction. It's a way to represent a fraction in a different way. There really are fractions that you're representing where the denominator is a power of 10. So you're really thinking about a fraction where the denominator is a power of 10. That's what a decimal is. So let's talk about and think about how to read decimals. And how do you read decimals? So if you take a look at this decimal point here, and we look at the numbers that are on the right of decimal point, that's where you get the decimals points part, and the tenths, hundreds, thousands. When you look to the left of the decimal point, that's where you have your whole numbers, or your integers, your tens, your ones, your hundreds. So how would we look at it? How would you read that? Let's look at this example right here. Let's say we have our decimal point, we put it in the middle. And let's say we have the number 15. We have 1 10, and we have 5 ones. And then we have 2 tenths on the right side of the decimal. You would literally read this as 15 and 2 tenths. This is literally 15 and 2 tenths. Let's look at another example here. Let's say we have 3 ones, and then we have 34 on the right-hand side of the decimal. So this would be 3 and 34 hundredths. You read that 3 and 34 hundredths. So essentially when you're reading decimals, how to read decimals, let's say we have this 14 and 9 tenths, you're really going to sit and look at and use the word and, because that helps you use the word and think about the place of the decimal, the place value that you're dealing with. In this case is the 10th place, and you'll say 14 and 9 tenths. So that's how you read a decimal. So let's look at adding and subtracting decimals. How do you add and subtract decimals? Let's say I have 23.50 plus 41 plus 0.38. How would I add this? Well, essentially, it's going to be equal to 64.88, but essentially what you do is you just line up the decimal points. That's all you have to do. You don't have to do anything special or fancy when it comes to adding, subtracting. You just line up the decimal points and you get your answer there. So it doesn't matter what you're doing, whether I have 20.50 or 14.65. I'm going to go ahead and add and subtract as normal, and I'm going to end up with 5.85. I'm just lining up the decimal points, just like you would typically do. But that's all you need to do is add up or line up the decimal places, and you'll be fine when it comes to adding and subtracting decimals. So when you think about it, that's all you got to do is line up the decimal places, add and subtract as usual, and it's easy peasy, if you will, when it comes to adding and subtracting decimals. Well, let's look at multiplying decimals. What happens when you multiply decimals? When you multiply decimals, let's say I have 4.075 times 3.9. What is that going to equal? How do we handle this, right? So let's look at this and let's give ourselves a little bit more space so we can work out this problem. So again, I have 4.075 times 3.9. Now, in a typical mathematics or multiplication problem, you're going to multiply the number 9 on the bottom by every single number on top. So you would get 36,675. You multiply 9 times every single number on top. Then we're going to multiply 3 times every single number on the top there. So 3 times 4.075, we're going to multiply, as we would typically do when we're doing double-digit multiplication. And this is the response, this is the answers we'll get at the bottom. We have to add these 2 rows up. And notice I have a 0 at the bottom for a place value. When I add this up, as I get my answer, I have 15,8925. So where do I put the decimal points? I have decimal points. I did my multiplication right. How do I figure out the decimal places? Well, I look at the first number and I see, hey, this first factor, I have 3 decimal places in that number. And I also have 1 decimal place in this number. And what that helps me do is to know that I'm going to have 4 decimal places in my final answer. You literally look at the number of decimal places in each factor, each number that you're multiplying together, if you will, and that determines how many decimal spaces you're going to have behind the decimal point in your answer. That's essentially what you do. So in multiplying, all you have to do is figure out the decimal places and all the factors or all the numbers that you're multiplying together. And then you just will multiply as usual and then figure out the number of decimal places you have to add in your answer. That's how you do multiplying decimals. Well, let's go ahead and divide decimals. What happens when we divide decimals? Let's look at 0.06 and going into 25.65. So we essentially have 25.65 divided by 0.06. What I have to do is I have to take that divisor, that 0.06, and I have to make it a whole number. I have to make it an integer, and I have to move it over 2 spaces to the right. Whatever I do to the divisor, I have to do the dividend. So I'm going to move that over 2 spaces to the right as well. And what that's going to give me when I move my decimal points over, what that's going to essentially give me is a problem where I have 6, right? I've moved that point over to 2 spaces. That's going to essentially give me 6, and it's going to make my problem look like now I'm going to have 2565.0, right? Because I'm going to have that 0 that'll help me, divided by 6. That's essentially what that's going to give me because I've moved my decimal place. Now I have to figure out how many times does 6 go into 25. It goes in 4 times. 6 times 4 is 24. I subtract 24 from 25. I get my 1, and I'm dividing as usual. I bring down my 16. How many times does 6 go into 16? It goes into 2 times. 6 times 2 is 12. I'll go ahead and subtract 12 from 16. That's going to give me 4. I bring down my 5. How many times does 6 go into 45? It goes in there 7 times. That's 42. I subtract 42 from 45, and that's going to give me 3, and I bring down my 0. And I figure out how many times does 6 go into 30. It goes in 5 times evenly, and I'm going to have no remainder. So I'm going to bring that decimal point right up there, and I'm going to just pull the decimal point straight up since I have all my numbers aligned, and that's essentially how you do with division. All you have to do when it comes to division is that you have to make sure you change your divisor into an integer, that you move over that decimal point to the right several spaces, and then you do the same thing to the dividend. And when you do that, you've done it. You finished that decimals. You finished dividing your decimals. So when you think about that, all you need to do when it comes to decimals that we've talked about, you want to make sure that you remember that decimals are a way to represent fractions. That not only they're a way to represent fractions, you can read decimals by looking at the place that you're dealing with. So this is 14 and 9/10. So you look at the place value to help you read decimals. In addition to that, adding and subtracting, all you have to do is line up the decimal places. When it comes to multiplying, you multiply as usual. You just figure out the number of decimal places in each factor, and you add that up to figure out what your answer needs to be in terms of decimal points. And then when it comes to division, all you have to do is change that divisor into an integer and move it over to the right so it's an integer, and do the same amount of spaces that you move when it comes to your dividend. That's all you need to do. That's how you work with decimals.